20 years ago, the idea of being able to watch a movie on a cell phone, such as the one that you see here, was inconceivable. You didn't have the right hardware, you didn't have the right performance, you didn't have the data bandwidth, you didn't have smartphones. And if you think about 20 years prior to that, when we had these big, huge phones, the idea of this device being widely available to the population at a price point that was attractive, you can see there the price, that the average teenager could have one of these, was once again out of scope. However, all of that has come to pass, and now we have all of that and a lot more. And so we are in this continuous cycle of transformation. And one of the things that has happened when it comes to technology is that we have a big disparity between those high-performing companies and those that are not. You can see here some of the research results from the book called Accelerate by Jez Humble and Jin Kim, where they note the time from commit to deployment, which is one of the most important numbers on this slide, can be 400 times the difference. That is, you are looking at the difference between months and hours. And when it comes to responding to challenges from the competition, this makes a great deal of difference. You can also see there that the time to recovery is much better. You can see there that the likelihood of failure is also much smaller. And what's surprising is that this gap is continuing to grow. It is widening. You can see here the latest numbers put it at 2,000, over 2,000, the gap, being the difference being between minutes now and months. And so there's a great deal here of disparity between those high-performing organizations and those that are low-performing. And one of the interesting things to note as well is that it's not just the unicorn Silicon Valley type companies. As it turns out, there are high-performing government organizations, there are high-performing universities, there are high-performing startups, as well as slow startups, slow universities, slow government organizations. And so one of the takeaways from this is that there are a series of techniques and patterns that give you a higher likelihood of being able to achieve this performance. We have always needed data and information and education in order to be able to do our work. In fact, in the Middle Ages, as a response to the lack of information, the apprenticeship model only scaled so far, the university system emerges to provide that education and that training. And this is a pattern that we see repeat throughout history. Roughly 1,000 years later, in the CERN laboratory, there's a researcher that is frustrated because he knows that there's now enough connectivity so that he can reach across the network and get access to technical publications from other investigators. However, at the time, it is simply too difficult. It requires too much coordination. He has to literally call the engineering teams. And so he spends a decade thinking about how to solve this problem. And in 1991, presents to the world the simplest software specification to date that simply has two parameters, the verb get and the file that you're trying to access. This is still what we do when we type in the address bar of our browsers today. We type that address bar, which is where we're going. It is a GET request, and the address is the file that we're trying to access. This was tremendously successful, and it led to an explosion of connectivity and a new generation of companies and the beginnings of a transformation when it came to how we communicated with the world and that two-way communication that was enabled by this platform. We have companies such as Yahoo, we had companies such as AltaVista, many of which have disappeared, but provided the first glimpses of what a new generation of services and offerings could be made in the market. If we think about 10 years later, thinking about 1995 as the realization of Tim Berners-Lee, who was the researcher at CERN's vision, by 2005, 10 years later, there is once again that interest in reaching further out. By this time, hundreds of documents, hundreds of millions of documents have been connected. but there's still a need for an abstraction that will permit us to reach out to programs and will permit us to reach out to data with the same ease that we were able to connect documents. Web 2.0 is about realizing that vision. And when that comes through, roughly around 2005, we have now coarser building blocks. We no longer have to write our software from the ground up. We can simply reach across the wire and leverage a service. One of the great examples of this is Uber, the company. They do not write their mapping layer. They use Google's. They do not write their own messaging layer. They use Twilio's, and on and on. And so we see companies going faster to market using coarser building blocks, and we see once again a new generation of companies based on this new abstraction and this new set of building blocks. If we move forward to what we're calling Web 3.0, the connection between things, once again, we're trying to reach further out. The first generation connected documents, the second one connected programs and data, and in Web 3.0, we're reaching out into the physical world. And the promise here is to be able to get earliest access to information and to be able to make better decisions based on that information. There's already a number of companies in the field of sport, in the field of oil and gas, and many others that are leveraging this infrastructure to be able to do that. The last platform that I will speak of is Web 4.0, which we're calling connections of trust. All of the previous generations, Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, are built on the traditional infrastructure that we have built throughout the past generations. Infrastructure where we have intermediaries, where we have trusted third parties, typically banking or the government in many situations. However, the blockchain paradigm presents a new opportunity when it comes to be able to make exchanges of value and to do that without a trusted intermediary. 3 properties are worth mentioning. The first one being identity, and that is you can have an identity without it being connected to a state-issued identity. And this is one of the reasons why it is being recognized by many trying to address problems of property or the unbanked or the refugee populations that do not have state-issued identities. We have the ability to have a currency on the platform. In the last 10 years have proven hundreds of billions of dollars worth of value and networks that have realized that vision. And the third one is smart contracts, where if we can have an identity and we can have a currency, we can accompany it with logic. If we're able to achieve any of these 3, we will have efficiencies that are likely to surpass that of any other platform of software that we've had in the past. And it's worth mentioning that the opportunities are not just in the fintech market, as is often shown. And I'm showing you here an example of the basic attention token, which is trying to tokenize the attention of users on browsers to disintermediate the social media companies like Facebook or Google, provide a reward directly to the user, and use the browser platform in a very different way. Having discussed 4 generations of platforms, I'm going to now single out a few key technologies that are worth emphasizing. The very first one is artificial intelligence, and there is a tremendous amount of investment across the industry, across university. MIT itself is investing $1 billion in a new college with a focus on AI. It has also given us the capability to have superhuman capabilities in well-defined domains. And that is that if we can describe or put boundaries around a problem well enough, we can usually, if we have good enough data, be able to surpass the human. We've seen examples in chess, we've seen examples in Go, we've seen examples in diagnosis by a doctor, we've seen the examples of autonomous vehicles. And although many of these are still maturing, there's tremendous potential to be had. The next one that I'll discuss is that of the cloud. The cloud is often discussed as a series of abstractions that typically start with infrastructure as a service and go all the way up to software as a service. However, it is a great deal more than that. It is the palette of colors with which you can create the new generation of digital products. If you want to consider a parallel to the 1990s, it is the desktop ecosystem. So if you're thinking about augmented reality, if you're thinking about storage, if you're thinking about compute, if you're thinking about security, if you're thinking about and on and on and on, the list goes on, those offerings all exist in the cloud. There's a great deal of variety, not just of goods and services. There's also a good deal of variety when it comes to delivery mechanisms and regulatory compliance. For example, in the US, there are clouds dedicated to the medical compliance, the HIPAA regulations. There are clouds that are dedicated to the federal government. There are clouds that are used in the field of intelligence. And so there is many times an apprehension to moving to the cloud for many companies. However, there are examples to be had across the domain, across the most sensitive types of environments, and there's good leverage to be had when it comes to the products and services. The other thing to note as well is as companies make their move to the cloud, their agility, speed, and opportunity for experimentation, because the cost is dramatically lowered, increases. The last of the key technologies that I'll mention is that of cybersecurity. If you think about the impact in our lives today, it is significant in the sense that from the moment we get up, the coffee maker, the car we drive on, the grocery store that we might stop at, the book that we might check out from the library, the bank we go to, the machines that we use in our work, all of them are executing software. And so an attack or a compromise on our infrastructure is a compromise on our lives, on our nations, on our security. So it is a tremendous challenge. There is a great industry that is responding to that challenge. There's a lot of good tools. There's a lot of challenges as well. But this is, without a doubt, one that we cannot do without. If we do not have security, we cannot operate. Having talked about 4 generations of platforms and key technologies, I'm now going to say the following. There is no package, no technology, no service you can buy that will digitally transform you. You have to look at the organization. And many times, many of us feel like this. We are overwhelmed with an onslaught of technology and opportunities. And so I'll start off here by addressing a couple of questions that are often asked. The first one is, how do you start and what do you do? When it comes to how do you start, there's a number of ways in which you can do it. There are top-bottom approaches, bottom-up, or a multitude of differences among different business units. But the guidance is to choose a project that is well understood, that you understand the technology, that you understand the use case, and that it's interesting enough so that you can leverage that win to further your inroads. The other thing when it comes to how do you start is that you should strongly consider your monitoring and your health of your application and your service. And a lot of this is enabled by a lot of the services that exist today. One of the spectacular fails in the United States was that of healthcare.gov, which after investing close to $1 billion couldn't get a website up and running. The team that stepped in to try to rescue this project did little more than apply best practices, the very first one being that of monitoring. They could not know if the site had failed. They had difficulty understanding what components were operational. They had all kinds of issues, and they were practically flying blind A lot of what was done in the early days, as mentioned, was to implement those best practices, and not just do that, but to introduce a layer of monitoring that allowed them to see the health, to see the performance, to see the reach, to see the number of users that were in the application. And so within a short period of time, they were able to do what tremendous expenses of money were not able to. The second question is, what do we do? The guidance here is to focus on the customer. If you look at the leading companies today, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and others, one of their great advantages is that they understand their user very well. They have great data, and they have an amazing feedback mechanism that gives them feedback faster than any of their competitors. So that means that they don't have to get it right all the time. That means that they can try out as many possibilities and opportunities and ideas as they might have. They can collect that information and make decisions on what is working best. That is a tremendous advantage to have. When it comes to the field of opportunities, many times there is a reaction of saying, well, yes, Amazon can do it, Google can do it, but what does it mean for us in agriculture? What does it mean for us in medical? And company after company, organization after organization, we're seeing the same principles being applied. When it comes to agriculture, the leading companies are collecting data from the fields. They are aggregating the information across geography. They're doing weather modeling. They're trying to learn faster than their competition. And in fact, even the planting of seeds gets split up into something close to a jigsaw puzzle. And the difference between being wiped out and surviving a winter is 1 inch of depth. And so that tractor goes out and plants that seed at the optimal density. Overseeding hurts yield, underseeding obviously does the same. So your ability to be able to connect to the user, to be able to leverage that customer information, and to be able to get that feedback cycle as fast as possible is one of the best investments that you can do. Once you've done that, your visibility will start to change. Your opportunities for transforming your business processes will start to emerge as well. Other examples in this field are those of companies, of a local company here making ovens, which you wouldn't think of something that would need that much monitoring. They started to instrument their ovens. They started to understand the way the ovens were used. They started to understand where they were moving globally. And that understanding led to optimizations in the product, optimizations on its distribution, optimizations even about servicing. So once again, by trying to understand the customer better, the ability to optimize our processes, to see new opportunities are fast coming once you have the data. What is the role of leadership? One of the interesting things that is happening in today's organization is that convergence of technical leader and traditional business leader. The business leaders are moving over into technology, or those that are technologists are moving over into business strategy. And so because of it, there's a tremendous opportunity to invest in the leadership of these transformations of technology. We talk about 3 dimensions here. We talked about why do we care, how, and the what. If we think about it, and the very first question is the vision, is the engagement. How do you transmit that passion? How do you cultivate that culture of innovation and adoption of technology? How do you govern these changes? And what technologies do you map to try to ground this approach? Think about the company of Apple. Their motto is very simple. Apple, think different. What they do down at the bottom is computer phones and tablets, and how they map is the technology. Now, the last thing that I'll say here in this section is that you can invest in IT and get some marginal gains. You can invest on the business side, on the leadership as well, and get some marginal gains. But when you bring both of those together is when you start to get the transformations. You start to see the opportunities. You start to think synergistically. And that is when a lot of companies make those big leaps. I'll close with a few comments about some of the patterns that we are observing. One of them is one that has been mentioned for some time, that every business is a digital business. And we truly have seen the spectrum here, from something such as agriculture that many of us had this romantic picture of the person out in the field planting the seed, that has now become an information company, to the high-tech applications. But it is more than just every company becoming a digital company. It is every company becoming an internet business, which means we have to be able to scale. We have to have capabilities of understanding our users, which means we have to be able to use those platforms. And so one of the things that we often hear is that companies that are, say, making bread or doing banking are now starting to think of themselves as technology companies that happen to make bread, that happen to do banking. Here's an example of one that makes donuts, and the leadership has clearly stated, we are a technology company that happens to sell donuts. We've heard the same thing from some other banking institutions. And one of the takeaways is that technology is now how you do strategy. And having that alignment, that synergy between business and technology leaders is increasingly important. Our president here at MIT has said we need bilingual leaders, meaning leaders that speak both business and technology. And when it comes to the leadership of the technology side, we're also seeing a leader that is no longer one-dimensional, a leader that can think across the technologies of digital transformation. What representation and what makeup here or any one of those technologies is domain specific, and so you might have more representation of one or the other. But ultimately, we see that marriage, we see that opportunity, and when that comes together, we see that acceleration, we see that innovation. And so in closing, we saw a number of platforms culminating with that of blockchain, talking about the efficiencies and the opportunities there. We saw a number of technologies that go across all of these, and the investments that are being made, the opportunities that exist, certainly the challenge that exists when it comes to security. And the other one is, once you look at the organizational aspect, how do you start that first project, the importance of monitoring. When it comes to the data, the distinguishing characteristic of capturing and accelerating that feedback cycle, and that this is one of the determining characteristics. I also mentioned as well that at the beginning, that it is not only the Silicon Valley unicorns, that we see high-performing organizations in government, in traditional enterprise, and many other domains. So it is not, it is within reach, and anybody has the potential to be able to realize these transformations.